Picture yourself walking across the gleaming marble floors of Venice's Doge's palace in the year 1075. Golden candlelight dances across polished stone, but the atmosphere feels heavy with dread. The most influential aristocrats in the Venetian Republic are pressing perfumed silk against their faces, their expressions contorted with revulsion. Many have already abandoned the Great Hall completely. The cause of this chaos is not warfare or political treachery. Instead, it originates from the royal quarters overhead, where a Byzantine princess endures her final days in a condition so disturbing it left the entire court in shock. Her identity was Theodora Duchina Salvo. Her tragic end would become one of medieval history's most haunting enigmas, demonstrating how cultural tensions, personal pride, and unknown ailments could devastate an entire royal household. The horrible odor drifting from her rooms proved so unbearable that attendants refused entry. Aristocrats deserted their responsibilities, and even her own spouse found it nearly impossible to stay near her. This was far beyond any typical sickness. Medieval writers documented this as a puzzling internal condition that appeared to radiate outward. The deterioration was so extreme that it left doctors completely mystified, defying everything society believed about existence, mortality, and human physiology. Before we explore this lost chapter of palace drama and medical puzzlement, if you appreciate discovering history's hidden secrets, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for similar content. Drop a comment sharing your location too. It amazes me that we can investigate these ancient mysteries together from every corner of the globe, united across centuries by our collective curiosity about what came before us. Nearly 7 decades before Theodora's arrival, another imperial bride called Maria Argyropolena had wed into Venetian aristocracy, bringing customs so foreign to Western culture that historians continued documenting them generations later. These two women, divided by decades, yet connected through their Byzantine heritage, would become eternally intertwined in a legendary narrative of cultural conflict masked as righteous condemnation. Our tale opens with what appears to be the most harmless item possible, a simple eating tool. When Theodora took her seat for the inaugural formal dinner at the Doge's residence, she withdrew something that left the gathered Venetian elite speechless with both terror and wonder. The object was a delicate, refined instrument crafted from gold, featuring 2 precisely shaped prongs emerging from an elaborate grip. Through a Byzantine perspective, this represented nothing more than a fork, an ordinary dining tool that Eastern courts had employed for generations. To Venetian eyes, however, it embodied pure sacrilege. Envision that moment. Theodora radiated magnificence in silk garments that shimmered with hues the Venetians had never witnessed. Her ornaments reflected flickering flames with each gesture as she gracefully guided food, portions toward her mouth using this peculiar golden contraption. Surrounding her, experienced traders and veteran ambassadors observed in absolute bewilderment as she consumed her meal without once allowing her fingers to contact the food directly. Murmurs erupted instantly. What manner of woman would reject using the appendages that divine providence had supplied? What meaning did this bizarre tool convey? And why did its appearance bear such disturbing resemblance to the pronged instruments that artists depicted as Satan's preferred weapons? The fork scandal may sound ridiculous to contemporary listeners, but in medieval Venice, it symbolized something far more perilous than improper dining etiquette. Theodora was not merely presenting alternative customs. She was suggesting that their current lifestyle was somehow insufficient, that superior, cleaner, and more sophisticated methods of living existed. This cultural upheaval extended far beyond simple lifestyle variations. Theodora created what essentially functioned as an imperial court inside the Doge's palace, featuring ladies-in-waiting chamberlains, pages, and an intricate service hierarchy that reflected the Byzantine court structure. She demanded the identical respect and ceremonial acknowledgement she had enjoyed in Constantinople, converting the comparatively casual Venetian court into something resembling the distant, refined realm of Eastern rulers. Her wardrobe provided another source of wonder and anxiety. While Venetian ladies donned practical clothing appropriate for their seafaring culture, Theodora appeared dressed in silks of extraordinary delicacy, decorated with golden embroidery and embellished with valuable gems. Ornaments were unlike anything Venice had witnessed. These were not the relatively modest pieces preferred by Western aristocracy, but complex Byzantine masterpieces that seemed to capture and radiate light in nearly mystical fashion. The meal arrangements within her residence became famous across Venice. Her table service was manufactured from pure gold and expensive rock crystal. These materials represented riches beyond most Venetians' understanding. Each dinner transformed into a dramatic presentation featuring multiple courses presented on plates that were themselves artistic masterpieces. The difference from conventional Venetian dining, where even prosperous families consumed food with their hands from basic wooden or pottery containers, could not have been more striking. Yet perhaps most unsettling to her new community was Theodora's obvious ease with extravagance. Her elaborate lifestyle did not appear excessive or potentially spiritually hazardous from her perspective. This gradual shift in Venetian society formed two conflicting camps. Forward-thinking citizens welcomed the newfound refinement, viewing it as proof of Venice's rising status and prosperity. Traditional voices cautioned that foreign customs were undermining established values and steering the city from its essential identity. The princess had positioned herself at the heart of a cultural battle that transcended her individual preferences. The medical understanding of that era provides essential background for comprehending subsequent events. Medieval doctors possessed minimal knowledge about disease spread, hygiene's impact on wellness, or connections between surroundings and sickness. When illness struck, especially with puzzling or severe symptoms, explanations typically centered on moral or mystical origins rather than purely biological factors. Palace existence in the 11th century was famously unhealthy. Massive populations dwelling in cramped spaces, inadequate sanitation systems, poor air circulation, and waste accumulation established perfect conditions for illness transmission. The lavish banquets and festivities marking royal events frequently resulted in food contamination or other maladies. Wealthy individuals might receive superior medical attention, but such treatment often relied on concepts bearing little relation to genuine disease mechanisms. Into this atmosphere of cultural conflict and medical ignorance, catastrophe was preparing to unfold in the most terrifying manner possible. The woman who had shocked Venice with her foreign practices was destined to become the focus of a medical enigma so disturbing that generations would whisper about it for centuries. What befell Theodora Duchina Saovo would transform her from a divisive personality into a legend. A warning story about the perils of excess, foreign corruption, and fate's mysterious operations. The symptoms emerged gradually, as such things typically do. Palace attendants observed that the princess appeared less vibrant during her morning activities. The aromatic plants and costly fragrances that had previously concealed the typical palace odors proved entirely useless against whatever was occurring beyond those decorated chambers. The princess herself recognized something was amiss, yet the medical understanding of that period offered no structure for comprehending her ailment. Byzantine doctors, despite their comparatively sophisticated education relative to Western colleagues, remained equally mystified. They administered conventional treatments of the time, bloodletting, plant-based medicines, prayers, and nutritional modifications, but nothing appeared to halt the enigmatic advance of her sickness. Palace operations began centering around controlling the escalating emergency. Servants created complex procedures for bringing food and materials to the princess's rooms, while reducing their contact with whatever was transpiring inside. They would deposit items at her entrance and withdraw rapidly, clutching scented fabric against their noses. Even the most devoted members of her staff started inventing reasons to shirk their responsibilities. The emotional toll on the palace community was crushing. These were individuals who coexisted with mortality as a perpetual presence. Child deaths were frequent, diseases ravaged cities routinely, and brutal deaths from combat or mishaps were ordinary occurrences. Yet this situation was unprecedented. This challenged their fundamental comprehension of human anatomy, disease development, and death's expected appearance. Historical records describe servants making religious gestures when passing the princess's quarters. It's not necessarily from piety, but from instinctive terror that whatever was consuming her might somehow transfer to them. The elaborate royal ceremonies that had become essential to palace culture were quietly discontinued as aristocrats discovered justifications to handle their affairs elsewhere. The princess's spouse, Deutsch Domenico Salvo, faced an unbearable predicament. The accounts emerging from historical documents are nearly too horrifying to grasp. The princess's body appeared to experience a puzzling collapse while she stayed alert, producing an extraordinary stench that permeated vast sections of the palace. Her flesh assumed an abnormal coloration. Her extremities began displaying signs of decay. And the smell grew so potent that it seemed to attach itself to anyone entering her quarters. Palace workers reported that even her linens and garments required disposal rather than cleaning. The actual walls of her rooms appeared to soak up the odor, rendering the spaces uninhabitable regardless of her presence. Attendants attempted burning every fragrant material available. Rare aromatics, valuable oils, foreign herbs, yet nothing could disguise what was occurring. The princess endured this nightmare while completely conscious and lucid. Unlike illnesses that might offer the kindness of confusion or senselessness, her affliction kept her mentally sharp while her body experienced this terrifying metamorphosis. She witnessed the disgust on observers' faces, watched servants escape her vicinity, and realized she had transformed into something others found impossible to endure. The solitude proved perhaps as merciless as the physical manifestations. This woman, who had reached Venice, accompanied by an extensive entourage, discovered herself essentially abandoned. With merely one or two attendants, courageous or faithful enough to maintain her care, even these devoted helpers could only stay in her company for short intervals, before the stench forced their retreat. Palace documentation from this era shows the frantic efforts to discover some remedy for an unsolvable predicament. Medical practitioners were requested from throughout the Mediterranean region, each arriving with personal theories and therapies. These tales expanded during their circulation, growing progressively more complex and disturbing as they traveled across Venice and ultimately reached distant cities. The princess, who had previously embodied Byzantine refinement, was transforming into something entirely different. A warning story about enigmatic perils that could emerge without notice. The financial burden on the palace was considerable. The continuous burning of scented substances, the regular replacement of ruined furnishings, and the payments to various medical experts generated massive costs. More critically, the disruption to standard palace functions hindered Venice's capacity to pursue the diplomatic and trade activities vital to its success. Palace employees began exhibiting what we might currently identify as traumatic stress reactions to their encounters. Workers who had served in the princess's quarters described recurring nightmares, reduced appetite and inability to endure specific odors that evoked memories of their assignments. Some requested reassignment to alternative roles, while others abandoned palace employment completely rather than risk additional exposure to whatever was occurring. Beyond those sealed chambers, the princess's personal staff, the Byzantine servants, who had journeyed with her from Constantinople, faced an especially challenging predicament. They had crossed vast distances to assist their lady in an unfamiliar country, and now they witnessed her enduring suffering that defied their understanding of human experience. Some maintained their dedication despite the horror, while others escaped back to Constantinople rather than continue observing her decline. As months elapsed, the circumstances grew increasingly dire. The princess's condition displayed no improvement signs, and the palace community approached its limits. The odor had spread so extensively that it disrupted operations throughout the entire structure. Even sections not directly linked to the princess's rooms seemed tainted by a smell that resisted all cleaning or perfuming efforts. The most unsettling element of period medical documentation involves their portrayal of her symptom development. The decay seemed to originate internally, progressing outward through her body in ways that contradicted every established disease pattern of that era. Her flesh assumed hues and consistencies that doctors had never witnessed, while the surrounding air grew more oppressive than any documented medical case. One exceptionally thorough report composed by a palace physician who succeeded in examining her during initial phases describes manifestations that contemporary medical scholars have difficulty matching to any recognized illness. The blend of internal breakdown, severe stench, and the patient's sustained awareness formed a medical enigma that questioned basic beliefs about bodily responses to sickness. The emotional damage to all participants was crushing. Attendants created complex procedures for accessing her rooms, scheduling their entries to reduce exposure while maintaining essential care. They would pause their breathing, finish duties rapidly, then escape to palace areas where they could recover from their observations and experiences. The princess's personal response to her affliction contributes additional tragedy to this narrative. Historical documentation indicates she comprehended precisely her situation and remained fully conscious of how her state impacted nearby individuals. She allegedly tried reducing contact with others, recognizing that her proximity caused authentic physical suffering to approaching persons. Palace archives reveal her continued attempts at preserving remnants of previous practices despite her worsening circumstances. She would ask for chamber perfuming with exotic aromatics brought from Constantinople. Though these fragrant materials now served urgent practical needs rather than simple indulgence, the difference between her earlier existence of refined elegance and current circumstances must have proved mentally devastating. Her condition's economic consequences reached well beyond medical costs. The palace required replacing furniture, decorations, and structural components contaminated by the lingering smell. Although these remedies merely intensified her agony without offering relief, the palace's efforts to control the crisis grew progressively frantic as conventional medical methods failed completely. Authorities sought counsel from academics specializing in historical manuscripts, searching for past examples of comparable ailments. They discovered fragmentary mentions in Greek and Roman medical literature, yet nothing offered practical treatment guidance. The princess's affliction had begun compromising her chamber's structural soundness. The continuous dampness and chemical alterations linked to her sickness started harming wood, textiles, and stone surfaces alike. Palace builders noted that the walls themselves appeared degenerating in unprecedented ways, as though the structure was yielding to whatever power was consuming its royal inhabitant. Period descriptions portrayed her illness's concluding phases as nearly incomprehensible to contemporary minds. The stench had grown so intense that detection was possible from significant distances beyond the palace. Venetian residents started avoiding entire city sectors positioned downwind from the Doge's residence. While traders discovered that merchandise stored in adjacent warehouses had suffered contamination from the persistent smell, the princess's psychological condition throughout these closing weeks represents one of her story's most heartbreaking elements. Historical documentation indicates she retained intellectual abilities and emotionally consciousness while her body experienced this terrifying metamorphosis. She witnessed others' disgust, grasped her situation's hopelessness, and considered her fate's implications for family honor and Venice's Byzantine relations. Palace personnel created sophisticated procedures for crisis management while preserving operational normalcy. They established sealed building passages that circumvented areas impacted by the princess's condition, formed alternative visitor routes, and implemented rapid replacement systems for contaminated items exposed to her quarters. Contemporary medical scholars have found it difficult to match these accounts with recognized disease classifications. Her condition's effect on palace fauna presented another troubling element that chroniclers documented. Creatures that had formerly wandered unrestricted throughout the palace grounds began shunning whole building sections. Even rodents and insects, normally drawn to food-accessible areas, appeared to escape regions impacted by the princess's sickness, implying her affliction generated an environment antagonistic to existence itself. As her suffering approached conclusion, the princess had achieved total separation from regular human interaction. The remaining servants attending her could endure her company only momentarily, and these fleeting encounters left them physically sickened and emotionally scarred. She confronted her ending days fundamentally isolated, severed from the refined court existence that had shaped her identity and encompassed by overwhelming proof of her body's enigmatic deterioration. The mythology surrounding her death was forming while she remained alive. Palace workers murmured about mysterious powers capable of transforming a vigorous young woman into something that tested the very limits between existence and death. These discussions, held in subdued voices across the Doge's palace hallways, would eventually reach throughout Venice and farther, generating a narrative that would survive the Byzantine Empire. When death ultimately reached Princess Theodora in 1083, it provided both relief and a moment that would resonate through European folklore centuries. The woman who had formerly captivated Venice with her Byzantine elegance perished alone in chambers that had grown unlivable to everyone except herself. The attendants discovering her remains reported that even posthumously, the mysterious ailment plaguing her final years displayed no improvement signs. Palace authorities confronted an extraordinary challenge managing her body.